For 60 years, every Sunday morning at 6:45, my husband would walk out the front door saying, "I'm going to get fresh bread, darling. I'll be back in 15 minutes." And I, faithful as a sundial, always believed him. 15 minutes. It was the cornerstone of our week, the one constant in a world that never stopped changing, a perfect, immutable, reassuring routine, until the day I decided to follow him. And what I discovered didn't just break a routine, it shattered the very foundation of my life, turning 60 years of love and trust into a museum of lies. Hello. My name is Sue, and I am 82 years old. This is the story of how I learned that the quiet, predictable man I shared my life with was a stranger I'd never truly met. It's a story of a secret buried under decades of silence, of a grave visited with a devotion I thought was reserved for me, and of a truth so terrible it was meant to stay hidden forever. I married Walter in the crisp spring of the early 60s. I was a young woman of 20, full of dreams that seemed as vast and blue as the Ohio sky. He was 35, a man who seemed to have already figured out the world. He wasn't a man of grand romantic gestures or flowery words. His presence was his poetry. He was steady, reliable, and possessed a quiet confidence that made me feel safe. In our small town, he was seen as a pillar of the community, a respectable man with a good, stable job at the textile mill. Everyone told me I was a lucky girl, and I believed them. I truly did. We weren't wealthy, but we built a good life in a small but welcoming house on a tree-lined street at the edge of town. It was the kind of house where the screen door slammed shut all summer long and the smell of freshly cut grass hung in the air. Our children arrived like blessings, one after the other, first our son, James, and then our daughter, Sharon. Our life unfolded with the gentle, predictable rhythm of the seasons. It was a simple life, a normal life. Of course, it wasn't perfect. We had our disagreements, moments of financial worry, sleepless nights when one of the children was sick. But they were the ordinary troubles of an ordinary family. There was never, not once, a sign that beneath the calm surface of our marriage, a monstrous secret lay dormant. For 6 decades, his Sunday morning ritual was as sacred as church. I never questioned it. Why would I? It was so simple, so mundane, it was invisible. At precisely 6:45, before the sun had fully committed to the day, I'd hear his familiar footsteps. "Going for fresh bread," he'd say, his voice still thick with sleep, his pajamas rustling as he grabbed his coat. And at 7 o'clock on the dot, he would return, a warm paper bag in his hand. The scent of fresh yeast and baked crust would fill our small kitchen, a weekly communion that started our day of rest. It was a tiny, insignificant ritual, repeated thousands of times, weaving itself into the very fabric of our shared existence. But about 3 years ago, the fabric began to unravel. It started so subtly, I almost didn't notice. Walter, then a man of 94, began to have nightmares. At first, they were just restless turnings, muffled groans that would disturb my sleep for a moment before fading. But they grew. Soon he would jolt awake in the dead of night, his body rigid, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I'd wake to find him sitting bolt upright, his face a pale mask in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Walter? What is it?" I would ask, my voice soft, reaching a hand to touch his shoulder. "A bad dream?" "It's nothing," he would always rasp, shaking my hand off. "It was nothing. Go back to sleep." His voice was a closed door. But it wasn't nothing. The nightmares became a nightly haunting, each one more violent than the last. Sometimes he would cry out in his sleep, his words a tangled, incoherent mess of syllables I couldn't decipher. Other times, however, the words were chillingly clear. They were a name. "Joyce, forgive me. I swear, I didn't mean to. Joyce." Joyce. The name landed in the silent bedroom like a stone dropped into a still pond. I had heard it only once before, in the earliest days of our courtship. When I gently asked about his life before me, he had told me a brief, sad story about a young woman he was once engaged to. Joyce. She had broken his heart, he said, leaving him for another man who had moved away to the city. She tore me apart, he'd said, his gaze distant. But then I found you, Sue, and you healed everything. He never mentioned her again, and I, respecting his past pain, never asked. Some doors, I believed, were meant to remain closed. But now, after 60 years, that door was being violently kicked open in the dark of our bedroom. That name, Joyce, was clawing its way out of his subconscious, not with sadness, but with terror and a desperate plea for forgiveness. And it wasn't just the nightmares. During the day, Walter's calm demeanor began to crack. He grew skittish, anxious. I would catch him looking over his shoulder on our walks, as if expecting to see someone there. He'd jump when the phone rang or when a car backfired down the street. His Sunday routine, once a comforting rhythm, became a rigid, obsessive compulsion. He had to leave at exactly 6:45, not a minute before, not a minute after. If I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water, or if the newspaper had been delivered late, delaying him by even a moment, he would become intensely irritable, his hands starting to tremble. And when he returned, precisely 15 minutes later, he was no longer the man who had left. He was pale, drawn, sometimes covered in a sheen of sweat, even on the coldest winter mornings. He would place the bread on the counter without a word and retreat into himself for hours. The first concrete piece of the puzzle fell into my hands on a cold January afternoon. I was sorting through a pile of mail on his desk, and I found the phone bill. I usually paid the bills, but this one was from his private account. Idly, I scanned the itemized list of calls. And there it was, a number I didn't recognize, called every Sunday morning for the past 3 months, always for less than a minute. A flicker of something, curiosity, unease, made me pick up the phone book. My fingers, stiff with age, traced the listings. The number belonged to the Green River Memorial Park, the town cemetery. My blood ran cold. Why on earth was my husband calling a cemetery every single Sunday morning? A few weeks after that, I was gathering his laundry, and I felt a crinkle of paper in his coat pocket. It was a receipt from a flower shop across town for a small bouquet of white carnations. The date stamped on it was the previous Sunday. Without knowing why, I folded the small piece of paper and tucked it away in my old jewelry box, a place I kept my most precious things. The next month, it happened again. Another receipt from the same florist for the same white carnations. And then another and another, a weekly purchase, a weekly secret. One evening, I came home from my weekly grocery run to find him sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at something small in his hands. It looked like an old wallet-sized photograph, but the moment he heard my footsteps in the hallway, he shoved it into his pocket with a speed that startled me. He turned to me, and I saw the unmistakable glisten of tears in his eyes. Walter, the man I had seen cry only twice in our 60 years together, at the birth of our son and the death of his own mother, was sitting alone in our bedroom, weeping. "Walter," I said gently, my heart aching for him. "Honey, what's wrong? You can tell me anything." He hastily scrubbed at his eyes with the back of his hand. "It's nothing, Sue, just an old man's melancholy. The years catch up with you." The question slipped out of me before I could stop it, a whisper in the quiet room. "Is it about Joyce?" His entire body went rigid. The change was so sudden, so complete, it was terrifying. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and the gentle, sad man from a moment ago was replaced by a hard, cold stranger. His face, a landscape I had known better than my own for 6 decades, became unrecognizable. "Don't you ever say that name," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that I had never heard before. I never want to hear that name in this house again. Do you understand me? Never. He shot up from the bed with an agility that defied his 94 years and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I was left standing there, my body frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. In our entire life, through every argument and hardship, he had never, ever spoken to me with such venom. He had never looked at me with such raw, undisguised fury. That night, lying stiffly beside him in the dark, the silence between us a suffocating weight, I started connecting the dots, the frantic nightmares, the panicked pleas for forgiveness, the Sunday morning calls to the cemetery, the weekly receipts for white carnations, the name Joyce, and his violent, terrifying reaction when I had uttered it. Joyce left me 60 years ago, he had said all those years ago. She went away with another man. But if that were true, why was he still dreaming of her? Why was he begging a ghost for forgiveness? I didn't mean to, he would cry in his sleep. What didn't he mean to do? My worry deepened, shifting from a concern for his mental health into something colder and darker. This wasn't just an old man's mind confusing the past with the present. This felt like a guilt that was eating him alive from the inside out. A guilt he had managed to suppress for 60 years, but that was now, in the twilight of his life, refusing to stay buried. In the days that followed, I watched him like a hawk. During the week, he was almost his old self, but the mask of normalcy was thin. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the constant anxiety simmering just beneath the surface. But on Sunday was different. There was a solemn, almost religious quality to how he prepared for his errand. He would shave with meticulous care, his hand steady despite his age. He always put on the same clean, pressed shirt, his best one. There was a gravity to his movements, as if he were preparing not to buy bread, but to attend a funeral. I tried to reach him one more time, a few nights later. "Walter," I said, my voice soft as I sat beside him in his armchair. "I know something is weighing on you. I am your wife. For 60 years, I have stood by you. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone. We can face it together." He looked at me then, a long, searching look. For a breathtaking second, I saw a crack in his armor. I saw vulnerability. I saw fear. I saw a man drowning in a secret, desperate for a lifeline. But just as quickly, the wall slammed back down, his expression hardening into stone. "You're a foolish old woman," he said, his voice flat and cold. "There is nothing wrong with me except your wild imagination. Now leave me in peace." That night, he had the worst nightmare yet. He woke up screaming, his body convulsing so violently I thought he was having a seizure. And through the choked sobs, he cried her name again and again. "Joyce, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." I held his frail, shaking body in my arms, rocking him like a child until the storm passed and his breathing evened out. But as he drifted back into a fitful sleep, something inside me finally broke. 60 years of trust, of loyalty, of unwavering love. And I was still on the outside of this immense dark secret. There was a part of him, a fundamental part of his story, that I was not allowed to access. That was the night I made my final decision. If Walter wouldn't tell me the truth, if he wouldn't let me in, then I would find my own way. I would uncover the truth myself. The following Sunday, I was ready. I dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, my movements silent and deliberate. I chose a dark coat and wrapped a scarf around my head, hoping to blend into the morning shadows. I didn't want him to recognize me if he happened to glance back. At 6:45 on the dot, Walter came downstairs, the picture of predictability. "Going to get the bread," he said, his voice automatic, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "Back in 15 minutes. I simply nodded, just as I had on thousands of Sundays before this one. But this Sunday was different. This Sunday, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure he could hear it across the room. I could no longer live with the questions, with the ghost that haunted our home. Something was tormenting my husband, something that had happened with Joyce 60 years ago. I waited until I heard the front door click shut. I counted to 100, my breath held tight in my chest. Then, for the first time in my 60 years as a wife, I disobeyed. I slipped out the door, my fear a cold knot in my stomach, and I began to follow him into the gray, sleeping streets. I was about to walk straight into the heart of my husband's secret, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever I found, there would be no coming back. The pre-dawn air was shockingly cold, a damp, heavy blanket that seemed to cling to my skin through my coat. Each breath I took was a small white cloud in the gray light. The world was still asleep. The only sounds were the distant hum of the highway and the frantic, unsteady thumping of my own heart. It felt like a betrayal, this act of spying. I was a wife of 60 years, not a private eye. My hands, gnarled with arthritis, trembled inside my pockets, not just from the cold, but from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what I was doing. I was following my husband, the man whose snores were as familiar to me as my own reflection, as if he were a common criminal. Walter walked with a purpose I hadn't seen in him for years. His stride was long and determined, eating up the pavement with an energy that belied his age. There was no shuffle, no hesitation. This was a man on a mission, a pilgrimage he had clearly made 1,000 times before. I forced my own aching legs to keep pace, melting into the shadows of doorways and behind the thick trunks of the old maple trees that lined our street. Each time a car's headlights swept down the road, I would press myself flat against a hedge or a fence, my breath caught in my throat, convinced I'd been discovered. But he never looked back. Not once. His focus was entirely forward, on a destination I was only beginning to dread. He didn't turn left towards the town square, where Miller's Bakery, with its glowing sign and the promise of warm bread, had been a fixture since we were young. He went right. He walked away from the familiar, away from the life we had built, and towards the oldest part of town. The houses here were different. They were relics from another time, with sagging porches and peeling paint, their windows like vacant eyes. The streets grew narrower, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. I rarely came to this part of town. It was a place of ghosts, of memories that weren't mine. There were no shops here, no friendly faces, just a quiet, pervasive sense of decay and finality. And then I saw it, looming at the end of the street, its ornate, wrought-iron gates like a spider's web against the pale sky. The Green River Memorial Park, the cemetery, the name from the phone book. My legs almost gave out from under me. I had to lean against the cold brick wall of a derelict building to keep from falling. It was real. This was his destination. The phone calls, the weekly bouquets of white carnations. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was all horribly, terrifyingly real. A wave of nausea washed over me. He wasn't going for bread. He was going to visit the dead. I watched from the corner as he reached the gate. He didn't have to knock or wait. An old man in a groundskeeper's uniform emerged from a small shack just inside the entrance, and he greeted Walter with a familiar, tired nod. They exchanged a few quiet words, too far for me to hear, but the ease between them was obvious. This was a weekly ritual for the groundskeeper, too. He unlocked the large padlock and swung the heavy gate open just enough for Walter to slip through. Then he locked it again behind him. I waited, my mind racing, a battle raging within me. Do I turn back? Do I go home and pretend I know nothing and live with this poison of uncertainty for the rest of my days? Or do I go forward into that silent city of stone and face whatever truth is waiting for me there? The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing my heart. But the need to know, the need to understand the last 60 years of my life was stronger. I had to see this through to the end. Taking a shaky breath, I pulled my scarf tighter around my head and walked towards the gate. The groundskeeper looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from disinterest to mild curiosity. "Morning," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. I hope I'm not too early. I've come to visit my aunt's grave." I felt the lie coat my tongue, thick and sour. The man's eyes, pale and watery, studied my face for a long moment. He was probably wondering why a woman my age was out at such an hour, lying so poorly. But he must have seen a desperation in me that went beyond simple grief, because he just gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Go on in," he grumbled, unlocking the gate once more. "Just be sure the latch clicks when you leave." The moment I stepped inside, the gate clanging shut behind me, a profound silence enveloped me. It was a silence deeper than just the absence of noise. It felt ancient, heavy with the weight of every story buried beneath my feet. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet perfume of flowers left to wither on the stones. The cemetery was vast, a sprawling labyrinth of monuments, tombstones, and family mausoleums. Rows upon rows of silent inhabitants. How would I ever find him in here? Then I looked down. The gravel path was soft and damp from the morning dew, and I could see a single set of fresh footprints leading away from the gate. His footprints. With my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I began to follow the trail, my own steps quiet on the stones. I moved cautiously, using the larger monuments as cover, peering around corners before proceeding. I felt a profound sense of trespassing, not just on hallowed ground, but in the most secret, sacred part of my husband's soul. I followed the tracks for what felt like an eternity, deeper and deeper into the oldest section of the cemetery, where the headstones were worn and tilted with age. And then, as I rounded a large, weeping angel statue, I saw him. He was about 50 yards away, his back to me. He was on his knees, kneeling in the wet grass in front of a simple, unassuming grave. It wasn't a grand monument, just a plain, gray marble headstone, darkened by years of weather. From my hiding spot, I couldn't read the name etched into the stone, but I could see Walter with a painful clarity. He had placed the small bouquet of white carnations at the base of the stone. His hands, the same hands that had held mine at the altar, were resting on the top of the grave, his fingers splayed as if he could feel a presence through the cold marble. He was talking to it. His shoulders shook with the effort, his words a low, desperate murmur carried away by the morning breeze. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I could see the anguish in the line of his back, the utter brokenness in his posture. And then a sound reached me, a sound so alien and shocking that it seemed to tear the very air apart. He was sobbing. This wasn't the quiet weeping I had seen in our bedroom. This was a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, a wail of despair that seemed to be ripped from the deepest part of his being. It was the sound of a man whose heart had been shattered 60 years ago and had never, ever healed. Walter, my stoic, steady, unemotional Walter, was kneeling at a stranger's grave, howling like a wounded animal. The sight was so intimate, so profoundly private, that I felt a wave of shame for watching. I should turn away, give him his privacy. But I was frozen, rooted to the spot by a horrifying fascination. Who was in that grave? Who could possibly command such a deep and lasting grief from the man I thought I knew? I don't know how long I stood there, motionless, the cold seeping deep into my bones. Time had ceased to exist. There was only the gray sky, the silent stones, and the sound of my husband's heart breaking over and over again. Eventually, the terrible sobs subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. He stayed on his knees for a few moments longer, his head bowed. Then, With a visible effort, he pushed himself to his feet. He stood there, a frail old man silhouetted against the dawn, and wiped his face with a handkerchief. He straightened his coat, squared his shoulders, and seemed to put his mask of composure back on. He gave the headstone one last, lingering look, and with a final, gentle touch on the stone, a caress, a farewell, he turned and walked away, taking a different path that led him towards a side exit. I waited until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded, my own breathing shallow and ragged. My body felt stiff, my legs unsteady as I forced myself to move. I walked slowly, hesitantly towards the grave he had just left. Each step felt like a mile. With every footfall, the dread in my stomach grew heavier, colder. I was about to learn the truth, and some primal instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to live in the comfortable ignorance I had known my whole life. But I couldn't. I had come too far. As I drew closer, the letters etched into the gray marble began to come into focus. My eyes traced the elegant, old-fashioned script, and then I read the words, and the world stopped. Joyce Annabel Reed, 1932-1958, beloved fiancé. I staggered back, a gasp escaping my lips as if I'd been punched. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a cry. I had to grab onto a nearby moss-covered monument to keep my knees from buckling. Joyce. The same Joyce from his nightmares. The same Joyce who, he had told me, had left him for another man, disappearing from his life forever. But Joyce hadn't gone anywhere. Joyce hadn't abandoned him. Joyce was dead. She had died in 1958, the very year he claimed she had left. She had died before I ever met him, before our life together had even begun. And she was buried here, in our town, just a few miles from the house where he had lived with me for 60 years. The lie was so immense, so breathtaking in its scope, it made me dizzy. Our entire history, the very story of us, was built on this monstrous falsehood. He hadn't been a heartbroken man healing from a betrayal. He had been a grieving man hiding a tomb. For 60 years he had kept this secret vigil. For 60 years he had mourned her, spoken to her, wept for her. While I was at home, his wife, raising his children, living our life, a part of him was always here, in this cold, silent place, tethered to a ghost. Who was this man? This man I had slept beside, cooked for, and loved for nearly my entire adult life. My trembling gaze fell on something nestled among the fresh and withered carnations at the base of the headstone. It was a small, silver-plated frame, tarnished with age but clearly polished regularly. Inside, protected by a pane of glass, was a faded black and white photograph. With shaking fingers, I picked it up. It was a portrait of a young woman. Even in the faded monochrome, her vitality seemed to leap from the image. She had a radiant, hopeful smile, the kind of smile that suggested she believed the world was a good and wonderful place. It was a face full of life, full of a future that she was never allowed to have. This was Joyce, his Joyce. The woman he mourned with a grief so profound it had lasted a lifetime, while I, his wife, cooked breakfast, completely unaware. I gently placed the frame back where I found it. A sudden, urgent panic seized me. I had to get home. I had to be back in that kitchen before he was, with a cup of tea in my hand, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't let him know I'd been here. Not yet. I didn't know what this secret meant, but his violent reaction in our bedroom told me it was dangerous. I turned and practically fled, my old legs moving faster than they had in years. I didn't care about the pain in my knees or the burning in my lungs. I ran through the labyrinth of graves, my mind a chaotic storm of questions. Why the lie? If she died, why pretend she had abandoned him? Why hide it for 60 years? And then, his nightmare words echoed in my ears with a new, terrifying resonance. "Forgive me, Joyce. I didn't mean to." Why was he begging a dead woman for forgiveness, What had he done? I burst through the front door of our house, gasping for breath, my heart feeling like it would explode. I tore off my coat and scarf, shoving them deep into the hall closet, and ran to the kitchen sink to splash cold water on my face. I tried to calm my frantic breathing, to wipe the look of sheer terror from my features. I had just finished making a cup of tea, my hands shaking so badly the cup rattled in its saucer, when I heard his key in the lock. He walked in, carrying the familiar paper bag. The warm, comforting smell of fresh bread filled the air, but today it smelled like a lie. It was a prop, a piece of a 60-year-old stage play. "Morning," he said, his voice even. He set the bag on the counter, just as he always did. "Morning," I managed to reply, my own voice a reedy whisper. "Good trip?" "Same as always," he said, hanging his coat on the hook. I watched him as he moved about the kitchen, his movements calm and practiced. He seemed more relaxed now, the terrible anguish I had witnessed at the cemetery completely gone, locked away behind his placid expression. The visit had been his catharsis. But as he turned from the counter with his coffee mug, his eyes narrowed and his gaze sharpened on me. A flicker of something cold and appraising passed over his face. "Were you out?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. Ice shot through my veins. How could he possibly know I hadn't left a trace? "No," I said, forcing a small laugh. "Of course not. Where would I go at this hour?" He stared at me for a long, unnerving moment, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. Then his gaze dropped to the floor. "Your shoes," he said, his voice flat. "They're wet, and there's mud on the cuffs of your slacks." I looked down. He was right. In my panic to get home, I had forgotten. My sensible walking shoes were damp from the wet grass, and small, dark smudges of cemetery soil clung to the bottom of my trousers. The evidence of my transgression. "Oh," I said, my mind scrambling for a plausible lie. I stepped out into the backyard for a moment, into the garden. I wanted to check on the rose bushes after the frost last night." "In the garden?" he asked, his voice laced with a sharp, cutting skepticism. "At this hour? In the cold?" "I couldn't sleep," I mumbled, looking down into my teacup, unable to meet his piercing gaze. I was feeling restless. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, thick with 60 years of secrets and a new, terrifying suspicion. I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me, trying to peel back the layers of my lie. I was certain he was about to accuse me, to demand the truth. But then, he let out a slow breath and turned back to the counter. "You should be more careful," he said quietly. "An old woman like you could slip and fall out there in the dark." It wasn't an expression of concern. It was a warning. The air between us was electric, charged with everything unsaid. For the first time in my 60 years of marriage, I looked at the man standing across the kitchen from me, the father of my children, the man I had promised to love and honor, and I saw a complete and utter stranger. And I was terrified of him. The rest of that Sunday passed in a thick, suffocating silence. It was a silence unlike any we had ever shared. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence of two people who have spent a lifetime together. It was a hostile silence, an active presence in the room, filled with the weight of 60 years of unspoken truths and my brand new, terrifying knowledge. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounded unnaturally loud, like a countdown to some unknown catastrophe. I moved through the motions of our day, setting the table for lunch, washing the dishes, folding the laundry, but my body felt like it belonged to someone else. I was an actress playing the part of Walter's wife, while the real me was screaming, trapped behind a wall of fear. I couldn't look at him, not directly. I would catch his reflection in the window or the polished surface of the dining table, and my breath would catch in my chest. He was a stranger. The familiar lines on his face, the way he held his coffee cup, the sound of him turning the pages of his newspaper, all these intimate details I had cherished were now overlaid with a sinister new meaning. His hands, the hands I had held for comfort, the hands that had built a crib for our son, were the same hands that had wept over a grave that morning. I kept seeing them, in my mind's eye, splayed across that cold gray marble, and a tremor of revulsion would run through me. He watched me, too. I could feel his gaze on me when my back was turned, a heavy, calculating pressure. His casual question about my muddy shoes had been a shot across the bow, a clear and deliberate warning. He knew I was close to his secret, and he was letting me know that he was watching my every move. The cozy, familiar rooms of our home, the place where I had raised my children and grown old, no longer felt safe. The walls seemed to be closing in, the air growing thin. I felt like a mouse being observed by a patient, silent cat. That night, I lay in our bed, rigid as a board, my back to him. I feigned sleep, my breathing measured and even, but my mind was a raging torrent. Every time he shifted his weight or sighed in his sleep, I would flinch, my entire body tensing for a blow that never came. The central, agonizing question repeated itself over and over in my head, a frantic, desperate mantra. Why the lie? If Joyce had died in an accident or from an illness, there would be sadness. Yes, but not this. Not this 60-year charade, this elaborate, pathological deception. People don't lie about a tragic death. They lie about things they are ashamed of. They lie about things they are guilty of. His nightmare words came back to me, no longer just a symptom of an old man's grief, but a potential confession. Forgive me, Joyce. I didn't mean to. A cold, sickening certainty began to crystallize in the pit of my stomach. He wasn't just mourning her. He was haunted by her. And people are only haunted by the things they have done. I knew then, with a conviction that terrified me, that I couldn't let this go. I couldn't go back to being the blissfully ignorant wife. That woman was gone, vanished in a gray cemetery at dawn. To live alongside him now, without knowing the full truth, would be a form of madness. It would be my own self-inflicted imprisonment. I had to know how Joyce died. I had to know what role Walter played in it. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could never, ever ask him. His violent reaction when I had simply uttered her name was proof enough of that. Confronting him would be like cornering a wounded animal. It was dangerous. No, I had to be smarter than that. I had to continue my investigation, but with more care, more cunning. I had to become a ghost, invisible, moving through the cracks in his secret world to find the answers I needed. My mind started working, formulating a plan. I needed information, facts, something concrete that existed outside of Walter's control. A memory came to me of a high school project my daughter, Sharon, had done years ago. She had spent a week at the town's public library, scrolling through old newspapers on microfilm for a history report. The library. It was perfect. It was a public space, anonymous. It held the town's entire history, its triumphs and its tragedies, all documented in black and white. If a young woman had died under mysterious circumstances in our small town in 1958, it would have been in the papers. It had to be. The next challenge was the opportunity. I needed a significant window of time, at least 2 or 3 hours, where I could be sure Walter wouldn't be home. My life had become so intertwined with his that I rarely had that much time to myself anymore. But then I remembered his monthly checkup with his heart specialist. It was a standing appointment, the 3rd Tuesday of every month. Our son James always picked him up, drove him to the clinic, waited, and then usually took him for a coffee and a donut afterwards. It was their ritual. It was my chance. The appointment was a week away, a week of living a lie, of smiling and making small talk and pretending that my world hadn't been ripped apart at the seams. It felt like a lifetime. That week was the longest of my life. I was a bundle of raw nerves, jumping at every sound. I felt Walter's suspicion in every quiet moment, every searching glance. I was meticulously careful, making sure my shoes were always clean, my stories for my brief trips to the local market always plausible. On the morning of the appointment, I felt a tremor of nervous energy so intense I could barely hold my coffee cup steady. I helped him with his coat, just as I always did, and kissed his cheek. The familiar, papery feel of his skin against my lips made me want to recoil. "Have a good checkup," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally bright. "Tell James I said hello." "I will," he said, his eyes lingering on my face for a moment too long. "You'll be all right here on your own?" "Of course," I chirped. "I've got plenty to keep me busy." I watched through the window as James's car pulled away from the curb, and only then did I allow myself to exhale. The moment the car turned the corner, I was in motion. I grabbed my purse and my coat, and was out the door in less than a minute, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grim determination. The bus ride downtown was a blur. I stared out the window at the familiar streets, but saw nothing. My entire focus was on the task ahead. The library was a grand, old brick building, a place I hadn't set foot in for years. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the scent of old paper, binding glue, and quiet dust filled my lungs. It was like stepping into a different, slower world. I approached the main circulation desk, where a young woman with bright, inquisitive eyes sat behind a computer. "Good morning," she said, with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you find something?" I felt my palms grow damp. I had rehearsed my story on the bus. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound like a perfectly normal retiree with a new hobby. "I'm doing a bit of personal research into my family's history in the area. I was hoping I could look at the local newspaper archives, specifically from 1958. "Oh, how fascinating," the young librarian said, her enthusiasm genuine. "We have all of those digitized now. It's much easier than the old microfilm readers. You can use one of our archive terminals right over there. Do you have a specific date or month in mind?" My heart skipped a beat. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm afraid I don't have an exact date. I was just told an event happened sometime that year." "I'll have to browse." "Not a problem," she said cheerfully. "I'll get you set up." She led me to a computer in a quiet corner and, with a few swift clicks of the mouse, brought up the digital archive. The front page of the town paper from January 1st, 1958, stared back at me. "There you go," she said. "You can just use these arrows to navigate day by day. Let me know if you need any help." Then she was gone, and I was alone with the ghosts of the past. My hands were shaking as I positioned the mouse. I didn't even know what I was looking for. A death notice? An obituary? What if there was nothing? What if she had died in a hospital in another city? 100 different doubts assailed me, but I pushed them away and began to scroll. Day by day, week by week, I moved through the year 1958. It was a slow, painstaking process. I saw advertisements for cars that no longer existed, read about town bake sales and high school football games, saw the faces of people long gone. The mundane rhythm of a year gone by washed over me. January turned into February. February bled into March. I scrolled through April, my eyes starting to ache from the strain of reading the small, digitized print. My initial nervous energy was beginning to curdle into despair. I was starting to believe I had imagined it all, that I was just a foolish old woman, as Walter had said. I was halfway through May when I decided to give up. My time was running out. James and Walter would be home soon. I would just finish this month, I told myself, and then I would go home and try to forget this madness. I was scrolling quickly now, my eyes just scanning the headlines. May 15th, May 16th, and then on the page for May 17th, I saw it. It wasn't a banner headline. It was a small, 2-column story below the fold, but the words seemed to leap off the screen and punch the air from my lungs. Young woman found dead in apartment. My blood turned to ice. With a trembling finger, I clicked on the article to enlarge it. I began to read, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would break through. The body of Joyce Annabelle Reed, 26, was discovered by her mother in her downtown apartment late yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Eleanor Reed had become concerned after being unable to reach her daughter by phone for several days. Police at the scene described the circumstances as suspicious and have not ruled out foul play. An autopsy is pending. Miss Reed, a popular secretary at the local law firm, was engaged to be married this fall. The room began to spin. It was her, Joyce. The article confirmed everything. She hadn't left. She had died. But it was worse than that. Suspicious. Foul play. Frantically, I clicked to the next day's paper. The story was bigger now, on the front page. Police investigate Reed death as homicide. The article was more detailed. She had been strangled. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone she knew, someone she had let into her home. I felt a cold dread so profound it made me shiver. And then I read the last paragraph. Sources close to the investigation confirm that police have been questioning several individuals, including the victim's fiancé, local textile mill manager Walter, surname. He was reportedly the last person to see Miss Reed alive. The name on the screen seemed to burn itself into my brain. Walter, my Walter, fiancé of the victim. My vision blurred. I had to grip the sides of the desk to steady myself, my knuckles white. He had been questioned. He hadn't just been a grieving fiancé, he had been a person of interest, a suspect. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a frantic, clumsy dance as I navigated through the following days and weeks. The story unfolded before my eyes, a 60-year-old nightmare coming back to life. Another headline. Fiancé detained in Reed murder. And then, 3 days later, the one that made me gasp out loud. Walter, surname, charged with murder of fiancé. I felt the bile rise in my throat. Charged with murder. My husband. The quiet, gentle man who read the paper in his armchair, the man who helped our children with their homework, the man who held my hand as I gave birth. That man had been arrested and charged with strangling the woman he was supposed to marry. The articles from the following weeks painted a grim, terrifying picture. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence. Neighbors testified that they had frequently heard loud, angry arguments coming from Joyce's apartment in the weeks before her death. Joyce's mother told the police that her daughter had been having second thoughts about the wedding, that she had felt Walter was becoming possessive and jealous. She told her mother she was planning to break off the engagement the night she was killed. She wanted to leave him, and then she was dead. The trial began in late summer. For weeks, the newspaper was filled with every detail. The defense, led by a sharp, expensive lawyer from the city, tore into the prosecution's case. They attacked the lack of physical evidence. They provided a shaky alibi for Walter. He claimed to have been at a business meeting 2 towns over, though the timing was fuzzy and the key witness was a business associate who owed him money. They painted Joyce as a flighty, emotional young woman, and Walter as the stable, heartbroken fiancé, a victim of tragedy, not the perpetrator. And then, on August 29th, I found the final headline. It was splashed across the top of the front page in big, bold letters I would never forget. Local man acquitted in fiancé's murder. I read the article with a numb, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. Acquitted. Not for being innocent, but for insufficient evidence. A key piece of evidence found at the scene had been mishandled and ruled inadmissible. A witness had changed their story on the stand. The jury had been left with a reasonable doubt. The law had declared him not guilty. But the paper, the town, the very air in that library seemed to scream the truth at me. He had done it. My husband was a murderer who had gotten away with it. I stumbled out of the library into the bright afternoon sun, which felt like a violent assault on my eyes. The world looked sharp and unreal, like a poorly filmed movie. I had married a man who had killed his fiancée because she tried to leave him. He had looked me in the eye for 60 years and lied. The story of Joyce leaving him wasn't just a lie to cover his grief. It was a lie to cover a murder. My whole life, my 60 years of marriage, was a sham, a carefully constructed stage play built on the bones of a dead woman. He hadn't chosen me because he loved me. He had chosen me because I was safe. I was young, trusting, and I didn't know anyone who remembered the scandal. I was his alibi for a normal life. I walked aimlessly through the streets, my mind reeling. I couldn't go home, not yet. How could I face him? How could I look into his eyes, knowing they were the last thing Joyce ever saw? I needed to talk to someone, not my children. I couldn't shatter their world with this, not yet. I needed someone who had been there, someone who might remember the whispers, the rumors, the truth that the courtroom had failed to find. There was only one person. My oldest friend, Brenda. She had grown up just a few blocks from where Joyce had lived. She would remember. She had to. I found a payphone, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to deposit the coin, and I dialed her number. The dial tone hummed in my ear for a long moment after Brenda hung up. I stood in the cramped, musty phone booth, the receiver still pressed to my ear, feeling the cold plastic sweat against my skin. My friend's final words echoed in the sudden silence, a chilling coda to the nightmare that had just been confirmed. "Be careful, Sue. For God's sake, be careful." It wasn't just a friendly piece of advice. It was a warning, steeped in a 60-year-old fear that was still alive, still potent. Brenda wasn't just remembering a story. She was remembering a feeling, a collective shudder that had passed through the neighborhood, a shared and unspoken certainty that a killer was walking among them. And I had married him. My legs felt like lead as I pushed open the phone booth door and stepped back out into the disorientingly bright afternoon. The world looked different now, tainted. The familiar storefronts, the cheerful faces of people passing by, the very sunlight slanting across the pavement, it all seemed like a facade, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched over a deep and cavernous darkness. I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, like the sole survivor of a shipwreck, washed up on a shore where no one else could see the monster lurking just beneath the waves. The walk home was the longest of my life. Every step was a conscious effort, a battle against the impulse to just sit down on the curb and weep until I had nothing left. My mind was a maelstrom of images. Joyce's smiling face in the newspaper, the cold, stark letters of the headline charging Walter with her murder, the look in Brenda's eyes as she recalled the community's fear. And woven through it all was the image of Walter himself, not as the gentle, quiet husband I had known, but as a young man with a hidden, explosive rage, a man capable of putting his hands around the neck of the woman he claimed to love and squeezing the life out of her. How could I go back to that house? How could I walk through that door and breathe the same air as him? The house was no longer my home, my sanctuary. It was a crime scene, a 60-year-old tomb where the truth had been buried. He would be there, sitting in his armchair, waiting. He would look up from his paper, and he would know, just by looking at my face, that I had found it. The fear was so intense, it was a physical taste in my mouth, coppery and sharp like blood. I thought about turning around, about going to a hotel, or to my daughter Sharon's house. But what would I say? How could I explain the inexplicable? I can't come home because I've just discovered my husband, your father, is a murderer who was acquitted on a technicality 60 years ago. They would think I'd lost my mind. Walter had spent years subtly planting the seeds of my supposed confusion and fragility, His defenses were already in place. I had nowhere to go but home. When my hand touched the cool brass of our front doorknob, I hesitated. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose myself. I had to be an actress. I had to perform the greatest role of my life. My safety, and perhaps my very life, depended on it. I plastered a neutral, slightly weary expression on my face and walked inside. The house was unnaturally quiet. The air was thick and still. He was sitting in his usual armchair in the living room, the newspaper folded neatly on his lap. He wasn't reading. He was just sitting there, watching the door, waiting for me. As I closed the door behind me, his head turned, and his eyes, those familiar eyes that now looked like a stranger's, locked onto mine. There was no warmth in them, no welcome. There was only a cold, silent inquiry. "You were gone a long time," he said. It wasn't an accusation, not quite, but it was a statement of fact that demanded an explanation. "Oh, the time just got away from me," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy to my own ears. I busied myself with taking off my coat, hanging it in the closet, avoiding his gaze. "I ran into Brenda while I was out. We got to talking and, well, you know how she can be." It was a weak lie, but it was the best I could come up with. "Brenda," he repeated, his voice flat. He was testing the name, testing my story. "And what did you and Brenda talk about for so long?" I felt a prickle of cold sweat on my neck. My mind was a blank. "Oh, the usual," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded like a cough. "The grandchildren, our aches and pains, the price of groceries, the things old women talk about." I turned to face him then, forcing myself to meet his gaze. I had to see what was in his eyes. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a calm, chilling watchfulness. He didn't believe me, not for a second. But he wasn't going to call me on the lie. He was going to let me squirm. He was enjoying it. "Well," he said, slowly picking up his newspaper, "I hope you had a nice time." The conversation was over, but the interrogation had just begun. The rest of the afternoon was a master class in psychological torture. He followed me from room to room, not with his body, but with his presence. If I was in the kitchen, he would come in for a glass of water and stand there, silently watching me. If I went upstairs to lie down, I would hear his footsteps in the hall just outside our bedroom door. He was a shadow, a constant, menacing presence at the edge of my vision. The small, intimate details of our life together had transformed into instruments of terror. When he came up behind me as I was washing vegetables for dinner, I flinched so violently I almost dropped the knife. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that once would have been comforting, but now it felt like the grip of a predator. "Careful there, Sue," he said, his voice a low murmur by my ear. "Wouldn't want you to have an accident." I saw the strength in his hands, the thick, capable fingers, and all I could picture was them tightening around Joyce's throat. I knew I couldn't continue like this. I was going to break. I needed proof. The newspaper articles were damning, but they weren't a confession. They were just a story from the past. I needed something more, something that was his, something that would prove to me, and maybe one day to my children, that I wasn't going crazy. My mind started to race, sifting through 60 years of memories, looking for a locked room, a hidden drawer, a secret place. And then it came to me. The old trunk. It was in the attic, a large, heavy, steamer-style trunk that had been there for as long as I could remember. When I was a young wife, I had once asked him what was inside. "Just old work documents and some things from before I met you," he had said dismissively. "Nothing important. The key was lost years ago." He had made it clear it was not to be touched, and I, the trusting, obedient wife, had never thought of it again. Until now. Things from before I met you. My heart began to pound. That evening, After a dinner eaten in near total silence, I made my move. "Walter," I said, my voice carefully casual as I cleared the plates. "I was thinking about Sharon's birthday next month. I was wondering if that old photo album from when the kids were little is still up in the attic. I thought it might be nice to find a baby picture of her for her card." He looked at me, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "The attic?" he said. "It's a dusty mess up there." "What do you want with that old thing?" "Just feeling sentimental," I said with a shrug, trying to appear harmless. "It's what we old folks do, isn't it?" He grunted, a non-committal sound, and turned back to the television. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. It was all the permission I was going to get. My hands were shaking as I pulled down the rickety folding ladder to the attic. The air that wafted down was thick with the smell of dust, cedar, and thyme. I climbed the steps, my knees protesting, and pulled myself into the vast, shadowy space under the eaves of our house. It was a graveyard of our lives together. Old furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, boxes of the children's school projects, my wedding dress sealed in a box that had yellowed with age. And there, in the far corner, half buried under a pile of old blankets, was the trunk. It was larger than I remembered, bound with brass fittings that were dull with tarnish. It looked ancient, formidable. A heavy padlock, rusted and formidable, held it shut. The key was lost years ago. Another lie. I ran my fingers over the cold metal. This was it. I knew, with a certainty that made the hair on my arms stand on end, that the final answers were locked inside this box. I spent the next half hour in a frantic, whispered search for something, anything, to pry it open. I tried an old screwdriver, a bobby pin from my hair, even the edge of a metal ruler. Nothing worked. The lock was solid, impenetrable. Despair began to set in. I was so close. I sank back on my heels, tears of frustration welling in my eyes. And then I saw it. Tucked away on a dusty shelf was Walter's old toolbox, the one he hadn't used in years. I rummaged through it, my fingers closing around a small crowbar and a heavy hammer. It felt like a desecration. The noise was terrifyingly loud in the silent house. I draped the old blankets over the trunk to muffle the sound, my ears straining for any sign of Walter coming to investigate. With my heart in my throat, I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the trunk and struck the end with the hammer. Once. Twice. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. I froze, listening. Nothing. I struck it again, harder, putting all my fear and rage and desperation into the blow. There was a sharp crack, a splintering of old wood, and the rusted hasp of the lock broke free. I held my breath, my entire body trembling. Slowly, I lifted the heavy lid. The hinges groaned in protest, a mournful sound in the dusty air. I peered inside. It wasn't filled with old work documents. It was a time capsule, a shrine. On the very top lay a small, neatly folded woman's sweater. It was a soft, pale blue. Beneath it, my hands shaking, I found a small box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was an engagement ring. It was simple, elegant, and it wasn't mine. My hands delved deeper. There were stacks of photographs, dozens of them, tied with a faded silk ribbon. I untied the ribbon, and the pictures spilled into my lap. They were photos of Walter and Joyce. A young, vibrant Walter, a man I had never known, his arm draped possessively around a radiant, smiling Joyce. They were at a picnic on a beach, dancing at what looked like a town social. They looked deliriously happy, incandescent with love. The sight was a knife in my gut. He had loved her. This wasn't just a convenient engagement. He had truly loved her, with a passion I had never seen in him. And that made what he did even more monstrous. Beneath the photos was a thick bundle of letters. I opened one. The handwriting was feminine, a looping, optimistic script. "My dearest Walter," it began. I cannot stop thinking about our little house and the life we will build there. I was looking at curtains today, and I saw the most perfect yellow ones for the kitchen. I couldn't read anymore. I felt like a ghoul, poring over the last hopes and dreams of a dead woman. These weren't just letters. They were the ghost of a future that had been stolen. I placed the letters aside, my hands numb. And then I saw it, at the very bottom of the trunk. It was a book, a small, handsome volume bound in dark green leather. There was no title on the cover. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with significance. With a sense of dreadful finality, I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was familiar, though younger, more forceful. It was Walter's. And at the top of the page was a date, January 1st, 1958. It was his diary. I held in my hands the one thing that could tell me the absolute truth. Not a newspaper's account, not a friend's memory, but his own words, his own thoughts from that terrible, fateful year. This was it. The confession or the exoneration, the final piece of the puzzle. I tucked the diary into the waistband of my slacks, my shirt hiding its bulk, my body cold with a terrifying resolve. I had to read it. I had to know. I carefully placed everything back in the trunk, arranging it just as I had found it. I couldn't fix the broken lock, so I simply closed the lid and draped the blankets back over it, hoping he wouldn't notice for a while. My mind was already racing ahead. I would wait until he was asleep tonight. I would take the diary into the bathroom, lock the door, and I would read. I would finally know what happened on the night Joyce died. I slipped the diary from my waistband and hid it under my side of the mattress, a secret heartbeat beneath our bed. As I did, I heard a floorboard creak on the stairs. My blood ran cold. He was coming. I stood up, smoothing my clothes, my heart hammering against my ribs. The attic ladder was still down. The toolbox was still on the floor. I hadn't had time to clean up my mess. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Walter stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim light of the hallway. His eyes weren't on me. They were on the open entrance to the attic and the dusty toolbox lying on the floor. His gaze slowly lowered, sweeping the room, and then it settled on me. And on the slight, unnatural lump under the covers on my side of the bed. He knew. He didn't know what I had found, but he knew I had been in his secret place. The air crackled with a sudden, lethal tension. The 60-year-old play was over, and the mask was finally, terrifyingly, off. Time seemed to freeze in that dusty bedroom doorway. The space between us, a mere 10 feet, felt like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. His eyes, fixed on the mess I had made, were as cold and hard as river stones. The air grew thin, heavy, charged with the volatile energy of a 60-year-old secret finally dragged into the light. The quiet, gentle man I thought I had married was gone, and in his place stood a predator whose territory had been invaded. I could see the calculation in his gaze, the rapid, silent assessment of the situation. He wasn't shocked or hurt. He was something far more terrifying. He was exposed. My body was paralyzed, but my mind was screaming. The diary. He can't find the diary. It was the only tangible proof I had, the only thing that validated the terrifying truth I had unearthed. It was my only weapon, my only witness. And it was hidden just a few feet away, a dangerous lump under the bedspread. He took a slow, deliberate step into the room, his movements unnervingly calm. He didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze methodically swept the room, taking in every detail of my transgression. The attic ladder, still deployed like a skeletal finger pointing to his secrets. The toolbox on the floor, a clear instrument of my violation. And then his eyes settled on the bed. They narrowed, focusing on the slight, unnatural rise in the covers on my side. It was barely noticeable, but to a man guarding a secret of this magnitude, it must have screamed its presence. "What have you done, Sue?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft, almost conversational. It was a terrifyingly quiet sound, devoid of the rage I had expected. This was worse. This was the cold, patient calm of a man who knows he has all the power. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, my tongue a dry, useless thing in my mouth. I could only stand there, a fly caught in a web, watching the spider approach. He walked to the bed, his footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. He didn't rip the covers back. He simply reached out a hand and slowly, deliberately pulled back the bedspread. And there it was. The small, green, leather-bound diary, lying on the white sheet like a drop of poison. He picked it up. He held it in his hands, turning it over and over, his expression unreadable. For a wild, insane moment, I thought he might break down, that he might finally confess, that 60 years of guilt would come pouring out of him. I was a fool. He opened the book, his fingers, stiff with age but surprisingly nimble, flipping through the pages. He didn't read the whole thing. He didn't need to. He went straight to the end, to the last entries from that terrible summer of 1958. I watched his eyes scan the page where he had confessed, in his own hand, to the murder of Joyce Reed. When he looked up at me, the quiet calm was gone. His face was a twisted mask of pure, undiluted rage. It was the face of a cornered animal. "You had no right," he hissed, the words a venomous spray. He took a step towards me, the open diary clutched in his hand like a weapon. "This was my life, my past. You had no right to dig it up." I finally found my voice, though it came out as a ragged whisper. "You killed her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of a truth that had finally been spoken aloud in this house. "You killed her, and you lied to me for 60 years. "She was leaving me," he roared, the sudden volume of his voice making me flinch. He took another step, backing me towards the wall. "She was going to throw it all away. Our future, our life. She called me jealous, possessive. She laughed at me." His face was contorted, his eyes wild with the memory of that night. He was no longer a 94-year-old man. He was back in that room in 1958, filled with a homicidal rage. "I loved her," he spat, as if the word itself was an excuse for the violence. "I did it because I loved her. I couldn't let her leave. I couldn't let her belong to anyone else." "So you killed her," I repeated, a cold numbness spreading through me. "And then you found me, a replacement, a quiet, trusting girl who wouldn't ask too many questions." His face hardened. "What was I supposed to do?" he sneered. "Tell you the truth? Hello, Sue, I'm Walter. I killed my fiancé, but don't worry, the jury let me go. Want to get married?" You would have run screaming. Everyone would have. I did what I had to do to survive. I built a new life. A good life. With you. I was a good husband to you, wasn't I? A good father to our children? "It was all a lie," I whispered, the tears finally starting to stream down my face. "Our whole life was a lie built on her grave." "You should have left it buried," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He was very close now, so close I could feel the heat of his anger radiating from him. "You were happy in the lie, Sue. We both were. But you had to dig. You had to go looking for a truth you couldn't handle." "I have to tell someone," I said, the words a desperate, foolish act of defiance. "I have to tell James and Sharon. I have to call the police." He laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound, like stones rattling in a tin can. "And what will you tell them? That you found an old man's diary? A diary, I will say, you forged out of senile fantasy? Who are they going to believe, Sue? Their loving, respectable father, or their poor, confused mother who has been getting more and more forgetful lately? I've been preparing them for this, you know. For the day your mind finally went." The chilling, calculated cruelty of his words stole my breath. He had been planning this. He had been laying the groundwork for my disbelief for years. The trap had been set long before I even knew I was in it. He took my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, his fingers digging into my flesh. "And the police?" he scoffed. "As I told you, there's no evidence. It's been 60 years. It's a closed case. There is nothing they can do." He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes empty of any emotion except a cold, terrifying resolve. "But I can do something," he whispered, his breath hot and sour on my cheek. "You know, Joyce wanted to tell people things too. She wanted to leave. And do you know what happens to women who try to leave me, Sue?" In that moment, looking into the abyss of his eyes, I understood. My discovery hadn't set me free. It had signed my death warrant. I was his prisoner. A prisoner in my own home, with a murderer who knew that I knew, and there was no escape. The months that followed were a living nightmare, a descent into a quiet, sunlit hell. That night, Walter destroyed the only proof I had. He took the diary into the living room, and page by page he tore it into small, meticulous pieces and fed them to the flames in the fireplace. He made me watch as 60 years of his secret, his confession, my only validation, turned to gray ash and smoke. "There," he said, wiping his hands as the last page curled into blackness. "It never happened. You never read a thing. We will go on as we always have." But we didn't. From that day on, I was under his constant, silent surveillance. The house, my home of 60 years, became a prison. He never let me out of his sight. If I wanted to go to the grocery store, he insisted on driving me. He would walk up and down the aisles beside me, his hand on my arm, a picture of a devoted husband. But I could feel the steel in his grip. He stood outside the door when I had my doctor's appointments. He would answer the phone, screening my calls, telling our children I was resting or not feeling up to talking. He began his campaign to discredit me in earnest. When James and Sharon came to visit for Sunday dinner, he would put on a masterful performance. "Your mother has been having some episodes," he would say with a sad, concerned sigh, patting my hand while I sat there frozen in silence. "She gets confused. She imagines things. Last week she thought a salesman at the door was an intruder. We have to be very patient with her." I would see the look of pity and worry on my children's faces. "Oh, Mom," Sharon would say, her eyes filled with a gentle condescension. "You have to let Dad take care of you. He's so worried." How could I tell them? How could I scream, "Your father is a murderer and he is holding me hostage"? They wouldn't have believed me. They would have seen it as the ultimate proof of my supposed dementia. He had woven his web so perfectly. My world shrank until it was just the four walls of that house. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant weight on my chest. I started to have trouble sleeping, and when I did, my dreams were filled with Joyce's smiling face and Walter's cold, dead eyes. I would wake up with a gasp, my heart pounding, to find him sometimes sitting in the chair across the room, just watching me in the dark. I tried to fight back in small, desperate ways. Once, during a doctor's visit, while he waited in the hall, I scribbled a note on a prescription pad and slipped it to the doctor. It said, "Help me. My husband is keeping me prisoner." The doctor read it, then looked at me with a kind, patronizing smile. "Now, Sue," he said gently, as if speaking to a frightened child, "we know Walter takes wonderful care of you. It's common to feel a bit anxious at your age. I'll write you a prescription for something to help you relax." He thought I was delusional. Walter had won. 6 months into my captivity, something changed. It started with Walter complaining of a persistent pain in his back. He, who never admitted to any weakness, started to move more slowly. The pains grew worse, becoming a constant gnawing agony that even he could no longer hide. One night, He collapsed in the hallway, his face ashen, his body slick with a cold sweat. I called an ambulance, my hands shaking not with fear for him, but with a wild, terrible hope. The diagnosis was swift and merciless. Pancreatic cancer. It had spread everywhere. It was inoperable. "How long?" he asked the doctor, his voice raspy but steady. "Months, maybe only weeks," the doctor replied gently. "We'll do everything we can to manage the pain." As we drove home from the hospital that day, a profound silence filled the car. I looked over at the man in the passenger seat, this monster who had stolen my life, and I saw only a frail, dying old man. And the emotion that rose in me, so powerful and overwhelming it made me ashamed, was pure, unadulterated relief. My prison sentence had an end date. I was going to be free. The illness ravaged him quickly. Within a few weeks he was bedridden, completely dependent on me for everything. The irony was almost too much to bear. I, his prisoner, became his jailer, his nurse, his sole caretaker. I brought him his food, I changed his linens, I administered the morphine that eased his suffering. Our children would visit, their faces etched with grief for their wonderful dying father. They would praise me for my devotion. "You're a saint, Mom," James said one afternoon, watching me gently spoon broth into Walter's mouth. "I don't know how you do it." If only they knew that with every act of care, a dark part of me rejoiced in his weakness, in his suffering. A part of me thought, this is for Joyce. As the end drew near, the morphine and the pain began to break down the walls he had built so carefully around himself. The cold, calculating monster began to fade, and glimpses of the tormented man underneath started to emerge. One night, as I sat by his bed, he reached out and took my hand. His skin was like dry paper. "I'm sorry, Sue," he whispered, his eyes surprisingly lucid. "I'm sorry you found out. It was better when you didn't know. We were happier." And then, in the final days, the full confession came. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a simple, stark recounting of the facts, as if he needed to give the story to someone before he died. He told me everything. He told me about his obsessive love for Joyce, his paranoid jealousy, the blind rage that had consumed him when she told him it was over. "I just snapped," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "I put my hands on her throat to make her stop talking, to make her listen. And then, I couldn't stop. It was over in a minute. The worst minute of my life, a minute that has lasted 60 years. He told me how his lawyer had gotten evidence thrown out, how a witness had been paid to disappear, and he told me why he had married me. "You were a new beginning," he rasped. "You were kind and good, and you knew nothing. You were my cover. But somewhere along the way, Sue, in my own broken way, I did come to love you. I didn't know if it was the truth or one final desperate lie. I didn't know if it mattered." He died 3 days later, in his sleep. I was holding his hand. I watched the last shallow breath leave his body, and I felt nothing. Not grief, not joy, not even relief. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The funeral was a quiet affair. Friends and family spoke of his kindness, his integrity, his devotion to me. I stood by the grave, a silent, black-clad pillar of lies, and listened to them eulogize a man who had never really existed. After everyone was gone, I didn't go home. I drove across town to the Green River Memorial Park. I found her grave easily. I had brought a small bouquet of white carnations. I knelt in the grass, my old knees aching, and placed them at the base of her headstone. "Hello, Joyce," I said, my voice quiet in the still air. "My name is Sue. He's gone now. It's finally over." I told her everything, the whole 60-year story. I spoke until the sun began to set, my words a final cleansing release. As I stood up to leave, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness for him. I didn't know if I could ever find that. But it was the beginning of peace for myself. He had escaped the law, but he had never escaped his own private hell. The cemetery, the weekly ritual, that had been his true prison. My children, James and Sharon, were wonderful in the months that followed. They worried about me, about my loneliness. One evening, about a year after Walter's death, I sat them down in my living room, the room where their father had confessed his lies, and I told them the truth, the whole truth. I saw their worlds shatter and then slowly, painfully, begin to reform around this new, horrific reality. There was shock, denial, anger, and finally, a deep, profound sorrow, not just for the father they had lost, but for the mother they had never truly known and for the life I had endured. That night, held in my children's arms, I finally cried. I cried for Joyce, for the life she never got to live. I cried for the young, naive girl I had once been. And I cried for the woman I was now, a survivor. My healing had just begun, but I knew I was no longer alone. My voice, silenced for so long by fear, was finally my own again. I had a new story to tell, not his story of lies and secrets, but my story. A story of survival, of truth, and of the fierce, unyielding strength of a woman who had refused to be erased. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.